Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dimitri Yuri. I'm a senior art history student in the VCUarts Qatar campus, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Stefano Carboni. Despite being the region with the largest Muslim population of the world today, Southeast Asia has traditionally occupied a place in the outskirts or the fringe of Islamic art history. I believe our guest will correct many of our misconceptions and illuminate our understanding of the job of an art historian, curator, and collector in the region. Dr. Stefano Carboni was the curator of Islamic art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1992 to 2008, where he was responsible, among much else, for the landmark exhibition Venice and the Islamic World of 2007. Since 2008, he has served as the director and CEO of the Art Gallery of Western Australia and the adjunct professor in the Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Visual Arts of the University of Western Australia. He has written numerous books and catalogs on Islamic painting, tiles, and glass. His most recent book of 2015 explores the wonders of creation and the singularities of painting, a study in the ill-Khanid London Qazvini. Today, he is here to discuss collecting Islamic art in Southeast Asia and Australia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stefano Carboni.
Thank you so much, Dimitri, for the great introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope, I obviously have to blame Jonathan and Sheila for putting me last today, and it may have to do with the fact that this is quite a remote area, and actually the inverted commas in the title in Islamic refers more to the fact that this, the area I'm going to discuss today is not so much to do with the fact that we are looking at historical versus contemporary art, but the fact that Islamic art in the region of Indonesia and Southeast Asia is a kind of ghost that floats and is not really acknowledged as being part of canonical Islamic art. So what I would like to address is really this from the point of view of trying to correct, to move from the very far periphery, a bit more central, into the main discourse of Islamic art. I'm also using the word, I'm not really concentrating much on collecting, but everything that you will see, all the objects, all the works that you'll see in the paper are in collections across Australia and Indonesia and Singapore. But if I had to focus only on the paucity of collecting, of the history of collecting in this region, probably my paper would be only 5 minutes. And so I'm going to have more of an art historical approach to this. One other thing that I wanted to mention is also that if I were in Australia, giving a public lecture or being in a public space, I would acknowledge that we are on a land which is traditionally owned by the elders, by the Aboriginal elders, who have been the traditional custodians, cultural custodians of the land for tens of millennium, of thousands of years before the advent of the colonial power. This is a way to understand also more the culture of the region, because Islam itself is a kind of superimposition, especially in Indonesia, on a civilization that takes layers after layers, but it always maintained that connection to land, to belonging to the ancestors' culture that informs also the visual arts in Islam. And so this is the reason why visually Islamic art in this area looks quite different, and that's why probably it's been ignored in all major publications. While Southeast Asia is geographically remote from the area where Islam originated, it includes today the most populated Muslim country in the world, Indonesia, as well as large representations in conservative majority Muslim Malaysia, and large concentrations in the southern Philippines, Thailand, and Myanmar. Myanmar, of course, with the Rohingya crisis, is losing part of the population in this terrible moment. In Australia, Muslims form a relatively large minority, today around 650,000, mostly distributed in the large cities. Southeast Asia includes, therefore, about 15% of the world Muslim population. These communities were created over the course of several centuries following transoceanic trade patterns and transmission, initially from and through South Asia and China, rather than directly from the Middle East. Consequently, pre-existing cultural practices were superimposed in a way that created a distinctive legacy. Inevitably, art created for Muslim societies reflected the multicultural facets of the area and its amazing multiplicity of local traditions. The constant movement of people within the seafaring archipelago also greatly contributed to the diversity of styles of Islamic art in the region. Physical evidence of early maritime contact between the Muslim world and the local Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms is provided by the well-known Belitung shipwreck, dated around 825, by coins dated 848 with the name of Al-Mutawakkil, found in Malaysia, and by ceramic shards excavated in Vietnam and Thailand. Early evidence of settled Muslim presence is offered by a number of coastal inscriptions dating from the 11th to the 13th century, spread over a wide area of the Western archipelago. Marco Polo was one of the first Europeans to report the presence of Muslims in Sumatra in 1292. Referring to the citizens of Perlac, he writes that, owing to contact with Saracen merchants, they have all been converted to the law of Mahomet. Islam did not succeed in the area only because it favored the interests of the courts or of influential mercantile and trading classes, but also because it struck a chord as a mystical and powerful truth. Many Sufi practices, such as dhikr, recitation, contemplative prayer, progressive stages in the spiritual journey, and the mentorship of master to pupil, became predominant because people would have already related to them in the Hindu and Buddhist environment that had proceeded from India a millennium earlier. It was Sufism, therefore, that would prepare the ground for a tolerant environment that merged successfully Islam with pre-existing local traditions. An appreciation of this diffusion of Islam into Southeast Asia is key to an understanding of the unique legacy of Islamic art that flowered there. Islam established itself as the foremost dominant religious and cultural force in the area by the 1500s, with highly developed centers before the advent of the Portuguese and later of the Dutch, such as Aceh, Melaka, Cirebon, and the Sulu Sultanate. Aceh was a sultanate centered on the northern tip of Sumatra and is believed to be the place where the spread of Islam started around, in Indonesia, started around 1250 AD. One of the oldest extant testimonies of Muslim presence near Aceh is the gravestone of Sultan Malik as-Saleh, the first Muslim ruler of nearby Samudra, dated 696-1297. The Sultanate of Aceh was established by Sultan Ali Murayat Shah in 1511 after he converted to Islam, and it rose to be the major regional power in the 16th and 17th century. The court of Aceh became also a celebrated center of Islamic religious scholarship, earning the province the nickname of Veranda of Mecca. Because of the strategic geographic location at the entrance of the Strait of Malacca with its major trade, Aceh was a strong competitor of the Sultanate of Johor and Portuguese-controlled Malacca on the opposite Malayan peninsula. As early as the 9th century, Ibn al-Faqih described the internationalism of the island of Sumatra, called Zabij in Arabic, and noted that even the parrots spoke Persian, Arabic, Chinese, Indian, and Greek. And there is plenty of evidence of the long-distance trade in high-quality objects across the centuries. Interestingly, Historical documents from Aceh state that the two sultans who ruled the world by divine decree were in Ottoman Istanbul and in the west, and Aceh in the east. This claim and promotion of powerful links with the Sunni Ottoman world is likely at the basis of the evident Turkish artistic influence over Southeast Asia. Sultan Alauddin, who reigned from 1577, for example, requested his court to wear Arab dress and consciously imitated Ottoman models in protocols, titles, and entertainment. Melaka, or Malacca, is also known as the historic state in Malaysia. It was founded by Parameshwara, also known as Iskandar Shah or Srimajara, the last Raja of Temasek, present-day Singapore. Following an attack from the Majapahit Javanese Thalassocratic Empire in 1377, he found his way south to Melaka, where he located a good harbor that was accessible in all seasons and placed on the strategic narrowest point of the Malacca Straits. The history of the Malay from the 17th century describes the Sultan of Melaka's embrace of the faith and subsequent enactment of extensive reforms that defined the role of the arts in court circles, with royal decrees creating comprehensive protocols to determine the use of color and media, the design of objects such as the kris, and textile styles within the palace. Cirebon is a sultanate in West Java and was founded by Sunan Gunung Jati, who proclaimed Cirebon's independence from Pajajaran in 1482. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the Sultanate thrived, became the region's center of trade and commerce, and served as an Islamic learning and dissemination center. The site, you may be familiar with this, is also known as the location of the so-called Cirebon shipwreck, datable to the last decades of the 10th century, which demonstrates the importance of the area from the commercial point of view on the international trade between the Islamic world and China. The Sultanate of Sulu was a Muslim state that ruled the islands of the Sulu archipelago, parts of Mindanao, certain portions of Palawan, and northeastern Borneo. The Sultanate was founded on 17 November 1405 by the Johor-born explorer and religious scholar Sharif al-Hashim after his marriage with the local princess Paramisuli. He assumed the political and spiritual leadership of the realm, and during his rule he promulgated the first Sulu code of Islamic laws, consolidating Islam as the state religion. A few extant examples demonstrate the superimposition of local traditions to the tenets of the new faith. Today, it is difficult to understand how radically different the Islamic notion of simple ground burial must have appeared in the cultural landscape at the time of its arrival, since the Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms practiced elaborate cremation and animistic societies' other burial rites, including human and animal sacrifice. At more than life size, the Pangolin Kempas stones are carved megaliths arranged around the 15th century graves of the otherwise historically unrecorded Sheikh Ahmad Ballari and Ahmad Majanu, died in 1463 and 1467. They are located in the village of Pangolin Kempas, not too far from Melaka. The most outstanding megaliths are nicknamed the Sword, the Spoon, and the Rudder, and they were carefully placed around the gravesite, most likely in order to suggest a link between the spiritual animistic significance of the megaliths and the Sufi inclinations of the deceased. This syncretic approach to religious traditions is evident also in the architecture of the period. A good example is provided by the astonishingly Hindu-looking gateway of the Sendang Duwur Mosque in Paciran, East Java, from the mid-16th century, and even more so by the reutilization of Hindu stone carvings, this one that just appeared, for the decoration of the Mantingan Mosque in Jepara, Central Java, founded in 1559. Syncretism between local traditions, both Muslim and Hindu-Buddhist, and colonial influence is also a distinctive trait of the arts of the region. Tradition attributes this panel to Panembahan Ratu I, also known as the Golden Prince, who was active in the late 16th and the early 17th century. An analysis of the painted tiles, however, suggests an 18th century attribution to the panel, when Dutch tiles were used to decorate the walls of Cirebon's Kasepuhan Palace, as well as the dynastic burial place of the local nobility. This is apparently the only extant such panel from Indonesia, and it may suggest an architectural decorative feature of early Javanese palaces. The composition depicts a few pavilions called pendopo. The quincunx disposition of the tiles parallels what would be expected if they represented the 5 main peaks of Mount Meru, the sacred cosmological mountain in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist cosmology, considered to be the center of all the physical, metaphysical, and spiritual universes. This peculiar mix of traditions can be still experienced today in a Muslim religious environment, such as this ablution station, where the water is poured into a Chinese jar on a stone stand decorated with Dutch tiles. This slender humanized body cannot be other than a depiction of Ganesha riding the Lion of Ali. The calligraphic lion stands on Karang rocks, also covered with Arabic script, and a flock of hornbills with calligraphic wings flies overhead. This powerful combination of Islamic, Hindu, and Javanese imagery must have had a strong talismanic significance. In Java, Islamic zoomorphic calligrams are known as Ukiran Mehmet, or Muhammad carving, suggesting a connection to the Ottoman world, whence they may have been introduced into Southeast Asia. This type of Ganesha image, the Hindu god who controls positive and negative outcomes and removes obstacles, is known as Talak Bala, or disaster repeller, and was usually placed at the entrance of a Javanese home to ask for protection. In pre-Islamic times, his image was popularly set up in dangerous places, such as crossroads or river crossings. The hornbill has long been a local traditional symbol of the afterlife. A similar apotropaic attitude towards Ali is displayed also on large banners used in courtly ceremonial occasions for the rulers to ride under them. These banners display imagery mostly associated with Ali, who is represented through both his Dhul-Fikar sword and the calligraphic lion, which is customarily transformed into the more familiar, in the area, tiger, as a symbol of bravery and supernatural power. An understanding of the qualities of Ali, both as a warrior and a saint, was widespread in Southeast Asia. Verses from surahs Al-Ikhlas, As-Saf, and Al-An'am are the most common on these banners, usually copied in the so-called Cirebon style with flora and leafy scrolling endings. The contrast of dark blue or black and the white designs also signifies the talismanic and prophylactic function of these objects. Today, many descendants of Indonesia's royalty continue to treasure these banners amongst their heirloom. Hindu literature was adopted and adapted in Islamic Southeast Asia to convey Sufi mystical concepts. In theater, the saint Sunan Giri is credited with creating a style of shadow puppets in 1553, Wayang Gedog, to enact the supernatural romance of Prince Panji. The shadow puppet theater, called Wayang Kulit, flourished after the advent of Islam. Before then, this theater performance was known as Chinese shadows, also in Arabic mystical poetry as early as the 13th century. In Java, the performance became associated with Islamic Selamatan or communal feasts. Another Muslim mystic, Sunan Bonang, 16th century, is said to have introduced the Wayang Beber Gedog, or narration with the aid of painted scrolls instead of puppets. At the same time, Sunan Kalijaga is reported to have established mask performance. This combination of shadow puppet theater, mask performance, and storytelling is one of the most representative and outstanding features of the transfer of meaning within local traditions in order to adapt to the new faith, with minimal changes in the visual and aesthetic outcome. Prince Panji is the archetypal Javanese culture hero, holding no weapon except for his kris, the source of his power, and combines the talents of bravery and sensitivity with spiritual depth. In the Bungie epic, his white skin represents innocence and purity. When he changes into a black skin, this underlines the personality of a warrior. Performances of the Bungie story became popular throughout Java from the 17th century, several versions of it spreading into Thai, Malaya, and Cambodia. The Serat Devi Ruchi illustrated manuscript in the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne tells a tale not too different in intent from Attari's Conference of the Birds. It depicts in a shadow puppet style a wondrous story from the transitional period from Hinduism to Islam in the 16th century, when Islamic teachers used Hindu narratives familiar to the Javanese audience to present Sufi mystical concepts. The illustrations combine the traditional wayang-style figures with naturalistic elements borrowed from European prints and book illustrations, the latter seen in the painterly style of the landscapes and sea creatures. The text became very popular and it eventually occupied a prominent position both in court literature and popular storytelling tradition. The journey of the warrior Bhima in search of the water of life has also parallels in the stories related to Iskandar. Although Bhima is from the Mahabharata epic, many elements are clearly inspired by Islamic mysticism. The conquest of self is presented as a struggle between faith and negative earthly passions. At the end of his quest of the knowledge of his true self, Bhima encounters the god Devi Ruchi at the bottom of the ocean and asks, "Who are you? What's your purpose? You have nothing, no one to serve you food and nothing to eat, and no clothes to wear." And the god answers, "If dried leaves carried by the wind fall in front of me, then I eat them. But if not, I don't eat." Bhima was astonished to see him and hear his reply. This tiny god with long hair and without a friend, the size of a baby, walking on the waters of the ocean, proud and alone. Bhima eventually reaches perfection because he acknowledges that the diminutive god is a mirror of himself. At the other end of the spectrum lies the influence of canonical Islamic art, most notably from Mughal South Asia, under the patronage of the Dutch East India Company, following the establishment of Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta, as the economic and cultural capital of the colonial power. This, in my mind, almost feels like an intrusion, or at least a deliberate superimposition, in order to cancel out the local traditions. Let me focus for a moment now on works of more specific religious content, again with a strong emphasis on local traditions. The decoration of this Quran, with interlinear translation in Javanese pagan script, consists of the repeated Shahada, written continuously around the red border of the frame, and again in the inner blue section, as if forming a circular, never-ending invocation. The calligraphy itself, as noticed in the large banner before, is strongly influenced by the so-called Cirebon style. The transfer of Quran manuscripts of the zoomorphic calligram of Ali's tiger may be surprising, but it seems to make perfect sense if one refers to the strongly perceived talismanic value of the Holy Book. Perhaps more surprising is the fact that some Qurans are housed in a box that prominently displays the head of an ancestor. This is linked to a small area on the island of Lombok, not far from Bali, in Indonesia. Here, Muslims of the Sasak people practice a syncretic form of Islam that incorporates Hindu and indigenous animist beliefs, called Wetu Telu, which means 3 times. 3 times means that they pray 3 rather than 5 times a day, that the 5 pillars of Islam are reduced to 3 because they do without zakat and hajj, and some observe just 3 days of fasting during Ramadan. Before the arrival of Islam, the people of Lombok practiced a form of animism known as Bodha, focusing especially on the worship of the spirits of the ancestors. Islam was introduced to Lombok in the 13th century, intermingling with Javanese Sufism and full of mysticism. In the 16th century, Sunni Islam was successfully introduced to the island. Despite the complete conversion of the Sasak people to Sunni Islam, the Wetu Telu remained highly syncretic, mixing animist and Hindu-Buddhist elements with Islam. Javanese Islam is characterized by a strong respect toward ancestors who continue to exert a major influence upon the lives of their descendants. Ancestral souls must be invited to ceremonies, therefore by extension to Quran reading and recitation, in order to help the living and facilitate their actions, hence their physical presence on the Quran box. To my knowledge, an in-depth study of the sculptural image of Burak and its origins in the Philippines region of Mindanao has not been attempted thus far. The attribution of a Burak figure in the National Museum in Copenhagen seems to suggest that the Southeast Asian developments may have originated in India. The Indian version of Burak may have found its roots in Hindu images of the goddess Kamadhenu, the wish-fulfilling cow with her peacock tail. While one of the main debates relates to its gender, male or female, the main difference in the depiction of Burak across time seems to boil down to the detail of its tail, either a horse's. Al-Bukhari actually describes it as a white-winged steed between a donkey and a mule in size, or a peacock's tail, this last seemingly deriving from the Indian Kamadhenu's tradition, and in any case linked to a Shiite rather than a Sunni environment. In Indonesian textiles, Burak has a peacock's tail, whereas in the Mindanao sculptures it is somewhat ambiguous, being raised and textured or curly, therefore not obviously a horse's tail. And here we have other examples. This is a Burak sculpture that I was able to acquire for the Art Gallery of Western Australia recently, and this is quite an interesting work in a private collection that almost shows Burak within the Maksura there. In the Philippines, there is also a possible connection of Burak with the Sarimanok bird, which has particular symbolic and aesthetic significance amongst Muslim societies in Sulu, Lanao, and Maranao. The Sarimanok is a symbol of power and prestige, and its image appears at festivities such as weddings. The development of the Burak sculptures, therefore, may have been drawn also from this archetypal symbol of the cultures of the southern Philippines and its talismanic association as the bird of paradise that dwells in the tree of life. And now we move to Australia and look at, this is obviously a very old map with the first sightings of Australia. You can see that it's oriented, actually, the south is this way. You can see Africa. And this is the first sighting of the coast of northwestern Australia. And this is a proper map that shows the connection, the close relation with East Timor and the archipelago above. Muslim Macassan fishermen from the southwest corner of Sulawesi began visiting the coast of northern Australia around the mid-17th century. Contact had been suggested from as early as the 1500s on the basis of radiocarbon dating for prahu ship designs in Aboriginal rock art found recently in the Arnhem Land. The main motivation was to collect and process trepang, sea cucumber, a marine invertebrate that was highly prized for its value and medicinal properties in the Chinese market. The term Macassan is usually applied to all trepangers who approached the Australian coasts, although some were from other islands of the Indonesian archipelago. At the height of the trepang industry, Macassans covered thousands of miles of the northern Australian coast, arriving in December with the help of the monsoon. It has been estimated that Macassan praus could carry a crew of 30 and that several hundred ships were involved in trepang fishing annually. Importantly, the Macassan crews returned to the same abandoned spots and settled for 4 months at various locations along the coast in order to boil, process, and dry the trepang before the voyage home to sell their cargo to Chinese merchants. These Macassan visits became incorporated into indigenous Australia ceremonies and beliefs. The subject of this painting, a 20th century work, but it is vital to keep in mind the chain of transmission through ancestors in Aboriginal art, is a Macassan boat associated with an Aboriginal sacred site on Bickerton Island. Here, oral traditions recount that Macassan people built a prahu in ancestral times, and the ship is accurately depicted with its sail made from palm fibers, whereas the large circles on the hull refer to holes in some rocks at the sacred site of Jumbia, where it is said the ancestral prahu stopped before miraculously being transformed into an island. Anthropologists argue that Muslim references survive today in a number of ceremonies and dreaming stories because the Yolngu people of the Arnhem land adapted creatively various aspects of Islam. Some speculate that the Macassans may have also been the first to bring Islam to Australia, and that in the area there are still visible traces of Islam in song, painting, dance, totemic design, funeral rituals, and religious recitation. The Macassans' annual long visits predated the European occupation of the continent and involved both spiritual and commercial reciprocity with the local Aboriginal inhabitants. Their visits were not intrusive, being based on some sort of cooperation, in the process inspiring new forms of local artistic and cultural expressions. Most importantly, this contact was free of the systematic violence that marked the arrival of European foreigners to this part of the world. As far as collecting Islamic art is concerned, Australia sits today in an odd place, not having a Southeast Asian dominant population and being the result of British colonialism over the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and European immigration. Its general disinterest and neglect of the Islamic culture and traditions of its neighboring area have resulted in very limited interest on the part of collectors, donors, and institutions in this particular aspect of the visual arts. The only exception on a significant scale being the Art Gallery of South Australia in Adelaide, especially with regards to Indonesian Islamic material. Notable works such as the Lakabi plate that you see here and the Trinitarius carpet, which is the gem in the collections in Australia at the National Gallery of Victoria, are far and wide in between unremarkable ones. This brings us to today's Australia and to the voice of contemporary artists, the majority of Western Asian descent or first-generation immigrants or refugees who are making an impact on the art scene. In the current widespread Islamophobic environment in Australia, their voices begin to be heard, offering a better identity and basis for discussion and analysis. Considering the size of the population, the landscape is lively and has been the subject of a number of projects and exhibitions in the past couple of decades, especially in local communities. For example, at the Casula Powerhouse in one of the most populated Middle Eastern neighborhoods of Sydney. As a collective, Muslim women artists are truly making a difference, especially at community level. There are quite a few young women artists, and I think that Idil Abdullahi, who's of Sudanese origin, is one of the ones to watch. For the sake of exemplification, I've chosen 4 artists to illustrate the most common trends on the contemporary scene, which can be summarized into the most prominent features of each individual artistic idiom: memory, reconciliation, political activism, and personal history. The artists are Iranian-born Hossein Valamanesh, Australian of Greek descent Philip George, Lebanese-born Khaled Sabsabi, and Afghan refugee Khadim Ali. Hossein Valamanesh needs little introduction since he is one of the most senior Australian artists today. He arrived in Perth, Western Australia from Tehran as a young man in 1973 and subsequently moved to Adelaide after attending a cultural exchange project with Aboriginal communities in the Central Desert. His artistic development has always been inspired by his Iranian heritage, Persian poetry, Sufi philosophy, the transient nature of life, and a strong sense of memory of actions and moments in life. His works are deceptively simple and minimalist, but always create a sense of wonder and inspiration in the viewer. I have selected here a few works, most of them very recent, which show Valamanesh's constant approach to his practice, from straightforward reference to memory, by making use of found wooden sticks, to casting the letters in bronze after collecting himself the twisted branches, forming the phrase, "This too shall pass," in Farsi. In doing so, he puts visually together nature and culture, Iran and Australia, memory and present. Belonging, voyage, place, and identity are present in all his work. A good example is provided by Where Do I Come From?, a map of the world that he has literally subverted by cutting it into minute pieces and recreated it through the calligraphic composition of a couplet by Rumi. This approach is even more evident in an earlier work, Longing Belonging, in which he sets fire to the center of a Persian rug and installs it together with the image that records the burning action. In Hasti Masti, which is now in the Agua collection, Valamanesh plays with the two words for existence and intoxication, their references to Persian poetry and his sense of belonging to two different cultures at the same time. In his words, my art is about not separating elements such as aesthetics, content, and form from each other. A door is opened and a glimpse of reality is sensed, and one realizes its ephemeral nature. Philip George is an Australian of Greek descent who grew up around Sydney's Bondi Beach and is a keen surfer. He's an associate professor in the School of Art and Design at the University of New South Wales. His family comes from Alexandria, and he refers to his origins as putting me directly back in the Middle East, where he travels regularly. His best-known work is an installation of 37-foot-tall thruster surfboards set upright in a modernist grid and facing east in the direction of Mecca. They are painted with Islamic patterns derived from photographs he took mostly in the former Ottoman areas. This was in 2008, in response to the so-called Cronulla riots of 2005, when a crowd of mainly white Australians gathered at the beachside of the Sydney suburb of Cronulla and violently targeted people of Middle Eastern appearance. For 2 days, surf culture became associated with white supremacist ideology, and conservative popular media seized the opportunity to portray mostly Lebanese immigrants as hooligans and aspiring terrorists. George's clever and unlikely association of surfing and Islam points out that Australians, in his words, are so culturally insignificant in the world that we rely on sport to boost our national pride. And that they have no qualms in embracing the words of his Alexandrian fellow, the poet C.P. Kafavi, who wrote, "Now, what's going to happen to us without barbarians? They were, those people, a kind of solution." At the same time, George's message is one of reconciliation. The title of the installation is the Inshallah series, and he clearly stated that it was an attempt to help bridge cultural and religious misunderstandings within Australia, addressing the paranoid attitude towards both the war on terror and the war on refugees. This political view is fully shared by Khaled Sabsabi, who left Lebanon at the age of 12 in the 70s during the Civil War and grew up in Sydney, creating his own brand of hip-hop as a teenager. His spiritual journey started when he returned to Lebanon for the first time 25 years later, and following this experience, he embraced Sufism through Ibn Arabi and Rumi, saying that it offers intellectual beauty, which I feel allows an individual to be both the thinker and the feeler, inspired by notions and actions initiated and driven by the heart. This brought him to work with communities exploring issues of displacement, identity, cultural and ideological differences, and racism associated with migrants. In his works, which often refer directly to conflicts, Sabsabi does not aestheticize war nor take sides, but shows a commitment to social justice. His videos and installation reflect both his background as a Lebanese immigrant to Australia, as well as his daily job with youth communities in Western Sydney. The medium he has chosen, digital and electronic, may seem a bit odd for a self-confessed Sufi. However, the obsessive repetition and multiplicity of images, sound, geometrically conceived compositions, and the need to be physically immersed in the spaces he creates eventually favor a spiritual journey for the viewer and a way to imagine the infinite. Sabsabi's large multi-screen video work, You 2007, offers a digitally enhanced interpretation of the victory speech by the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, which followed the humiliating retreat of the Israeli forces in the same year. The victory crowds are conjured through the progressive multiplication of images, and Nasrallah's icon is surrounded by a ghostly halo that suggests a divine status. Sabsabi is not a Shiite, but he was fascinated by the leading role that Hezbollah played in resisting the Israelis. Of less explicit political content, Syria, 2012, is a word fractured and refracted geometry with a high degree of formal and aesthetic complexity. It incorporates a large number of moving images from the artist's large archive accumulating during his visit to Damascus. In his words, he worked toward the progressive collapsing of space, the territorial space of nations, and the mind and of the soul. 70,000 Vase, 2014, an obvious reference to the vase of light and darkness separating an individual from the divine, is a media landscape in which the viewer can choose to wear the 3D glasses or experience it in 2D. The 3D option allows for a change of perspective according to the viewer's position, thus creating vanishing points. Sabsabi's mathematically carefully conceived 700 image rotation on the 100 monitors also allows for blank monitors approximately every 30 seconds, connecting his ideas to the Sufi dualities of visible and invisible. Wonderland 2014 brings us back to Sabsabi's adopted country. A 2-channel video depicts chanting crowds at a soccer match, the fans cheering and swinging almost in unison. They sing the same hymns, sport the same flags, and are both obvious supporters of the Western Sydney Wanderers, the working-class suburb in which Sabsabi lives and works. Their allegiance is convergent, however, the artist forces the viewer to make a choice, because if one stands between the two speakers, the noise becomes unbearably dissonant, and the only relief is to move towards one side and essentially pick it versus the same other side. Wonderland is also a political statement for Sabsabi. I am Australian, whatever that means. I have lived here for over 80% of my life, and now other Australians need to be tolerant of me? What an ill-minded conclusion. Tolerance is such a loaded word which I strongly dislike. To tolerate means you're willing to stomach the pain, like a root canal done on your teeth. The deeply personal is instead the main creative impulse for Khadim Ali, a Hazara originally from Bamiyan, who grew up in Quetta as an Afghan refugee, moved to Tehran when he was 18, only to be deported back to Pakistan in Lahore 2 years later. He arrived in Sydney in 2009 under a distinguished talent visa, thanks to his refugee Hazara background and his artistic skills in miniature as well as mural painting learned in Tehran and Lahore. His rise as one of the most sought-after artists in Australia has been constant, not only for his skillful technique and the arresting aesthetic appeal of his work, but especially because the subject is very intimate and personal, and the message is immediate and straightforward. His first Australian works on paper addressed in an indirect way the devastation of Afghanistan by the Taliban through the Bamiyan and Rustam series, where the still-standing Buddhas are set as the background to his alter ego, a demonized, long-bearded Rustam. Rustam was the hero of his youth, prompted by his grandfather's storytelling abilities in reciting the Shahnameh. But in his own words, all these years I had lived a hero's life, but it was a false life. I was actually a demon. I had been demonized and dehumanized. It was then that I switched from my hero to the demon, and I started painting demons. This demonization of the Shia Hazaras, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, has been a constant feature of his work since 2009, growing in complexity from the miniature on paper initial approach to a whole series of ambitious knotted carpets exhibited in Brisbane in 2014. And you can also see I had this discussion with him that he's found inspiration in the Istanbul albums, of which this is the Sia Kalam paintings. This year, he created a 15-meter-long mural in the foyer of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, and is currently doing similar work in both Kabul and Lahore, with solo shows there. The impressive work, The Arrival of the Demons, is as much about the Hazaras and himself as it is about all asylum seekers arriving in Australia. These horned, bearded, pot-bellied figures who seem a bit lost, unemotional, but with an intense gaze, seek a land where they would be called humans, but they find themselves demonized through the immigration system. This is my collective self-portrait. It is a shared sorrow, and that makes it easier to tolerate. As for the future of Islamic art in Australia, obviously it is difficult to imagine it, especially in view of globalization and the constant movement of people, artists, and ideas across the world. But it is reassuring to see that artists of Middle Eastern, Western Asian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian Muslim background are now being noticed and are making much more noise, both as a voice of dissent and one of integration in Australian society than they used to until just a few years ago. The government's and in general the average white Australian's attitude to refugees, to immigrant rights, the indigenous people, and Islamophobia has a long way to go before it can reach an acceptable level of civility and respect. But I'd like to think that in a not so distant future, Khadim Ali's demons will turn back into Rustam's heroes, also in the collective Australian consciousness. Thank you.